So this is a discussion of Cincinnati's Potter's Field. But people often have the question, what is a Potter's Field and where does that name come from? So let's start with that. The name is actually biblical. So what happened is Judas betrays Jesus and he sells him out for 30 pieces of silver. That's what he gets paid for identifying Jesus. So afterwards, he is riddled with guilt and he wants to give the money back. And the priests and elders who paid him this 30 pieces of silver, they don't want to take it back because this is now blood money. And I don't really understand this part of the story, exactly why the people who paid him now won't take it back. But for whatever reason, there's this 30 pieces of silver that everybody's standing around saying, I don't want it, I won't take it. So the question arises of what do we do with this money? So they use this 30 pieces of silver to buy a piece of real estate. And they buy some land from a potter, a guy who made things out of clay. And he'd actually harvested all of the clay out of this land. So it really wasn't any use to the potter anymore, and you couldn't grow anything on it. So it was a cheap piece of real estate. And they bought this real estate to use to bury strangers and nomads on. So this is the very first potter's field, and that's where it gets its name. It was purchased from a potter. So in its very early initial concept, Potter's Field was a place where strangers were buried. Strangers, nomads. And if you think about that period of time, a couple thousand years ago, nomads were relatively common, and it was kind of a value neutral sort of characterization of a person. You traveled from place to place. You actually brought valuable information with you of other places, what else was going on in the world. So a nomad, was kind of a value neutral designation of a person. You were unknown, you didn't have family, maybe there's a little bit of something wrong with you as a result of that, but you're not valueless. You just don't have people around to bury you. So Potter's Field as a concept, takes off from this initial Potter's Field and expands, through particularly Christian countries. But as it does that, it starts to kind of pick up different connotations. And this initial kind of value neutral concept of it starts to morph over time. So we see that, by the time we're getting into the 1700s in Europe, this concept of the nomad and the stranger, it's still there, but it's also starting to kind of morph into more to do with people who are indigent, people who are mentally ill, people who die in various institutions. So, the whole idea of nomad starts to become more of a dedication to a place where we bury the indigent. And when we think about, the indigent in the 1700s in a European city, that's starting to have, negative connotations to it because a lot of people are poor, but, we're really talking about those people who don't have any of the family resources, anybody to kind of take care of them. So the poorest of the poor are buried in potter's fields. You also then start to see criminals being buried in potter's field. And I don't mean you start to see this in the 1700s, it was already occurring. But when we're getting into places like, London in the 1700s, criminals are composing a large percentage of the people that are being buried in London's potter's fields. If you are publicly executed, you're probably winding up in a potter's field. And these grounds were typically unconsecrated grounds because they were public burying grounds. They were not affiliated with a specific church or religion. So they hadn't been blessed. And in some religious traditions, that's a very important thing to what happens to you in the afterlife. So from the beginning of Potter's Field in biblical times up until the time that we're into the 1700s, early 1800s in Europe, Potter's Fields have spread throughout Europe, and they often have this kind of negative connotation to them. And not every Potter's Field is called a Potter's Field. A lot of them are, but some of them have different names. And what they're called and who is buried there really kind of depends on who's in control of that particular piece of ground. The Ohio Mental Asylum in Athens, for example, it has a Potter's Field next to it, and the people that are buried in that Potter's Field are all people who died in that institution. So all of them came specifically from that one mental institution. And, when we think about people who died in any of these institutions, any kind of hospitalized setting in the 1800s in the US, we had a very terrible understanding of mental illness back then. We don't have a particularly good understanding or treatment of it today, but it was really abhorrent in the 1800s. And when you look at conditions like PTSD, and if you saw any kind of really serious battle during the Civil War, and you did not come out of that with a nice case of PTSD, I think there's something wrong with you rather than the people that did. So PTSD is real. It's not a recent phenomenon. People had it throughout wars, throughout history. But it was historically treated as something, to hide, deny, be ashamed of. And we were definitely doing that with a lot of Civil War veterans and then later veterans of World War I as well. So if you died in like a mental institution, and you weren't really able to function in normal society because you had untreated and very, very severe PTSD, you would wind up in this Potter's Field. And some institutions that controlled Potter's Fields were prisons. You see that in New York, and today in New York, in fact, their indigent burial ground is still run by the prison service. So by the time we reach the 1800s in the United States, this concept that starts biblically, spreads throughout European countries in the hundreds of years that follows, it follows us to the United States, and every major city in the 1800s had a Potter's Field, a burial ground that was maintained by typically a municipality or some other form of local government, county government, whatever. And it's where we would bury people who could not afford private burials. And, that was composed of a pretty broad range of people. You could be indigent and buried there for a number of reasons. Just because you were poor, maybe because you were unknown, unclaimed, or because you died in some sort of institution. So who got buried in Potter's Field really kind of depends on the individual Potter's Field. Some of those cemeteries contain the remains of a lot of criminals, people who are criminals in life, obviously. They're not committing crimes anymore. But some of those places, are full of people that died in mental institutions. Some are people who died in prison. Some, like in Cincinnati, are really just people who died poor, and many of them unknown, but a lot of them, had family and friends that cared for them, who loved them, but who just didn't have the financial resources to pay for a private burial. So Cincinnati, actually, our Potter's Field contains the remains of people who committed, a wide variety of petty crimes throughout life. But for the most part, it's not a place where a lot of people who came from prisons or, who were publicly executed or buried. Most of our worst, most heinous criminals of the 1800s all actually received private burials. So the people that are in our potter's field are mostly people who died poor, and a lot of them died in hospitals of infectious diseases or wasting diseases that really kind of drained them of their money before it drained them of their lives. So who maintains them? It depends again, on the institution. And a lot of these institutions are now defunct, like the Ohio Mental Asylum. A lot of prisons are still in operation. New York's Hart Island has really kind of continued sort of unabated from what it was 100 years ago because it continues to be controlled by the prison system. But almost all of these potter's fields are maintained. They're maintained by somebody, by a city, by a county. If it's just basic mowing services, whoever owns that cemetery takes care of it, which kind of seems like common human decency. That's not the case in the city of Cincinnati, and that's actually pretty rare. So while potter's fields are in every city across the U.S., Cincinnati really kind of stands out in its gross, obscene neglect of its potter's field. Now, the question often arises with people when we talk about potter's fields in general of whether we still use them. What do we do today? And as I just mentioned, there's still a potter's field in New York called Hart Island that continues to operate basically like it always has. It's kind of shocking that in New York, people are still buried in simple pine boxes in mass graves. They're buried 2 or 3 people deep, and in these big trenches. So that's what happens to you when you die indigent in New York. In Hamilton County, we have a different system. I think this is more common across most of the U.S. If you die indigent in Hamilton County, you're almost certainly going to be cremated, and then your cremains are going to be buried in a cemetery that is dedicated to those purposes. In Cincinnati today, that cemetery is in South Fairmount, and there is today state legislation in the state of Ohio that requires those remains to have some sort of placard. So you get a very simple, gravestone. The ones that are in use today in Hamilton County are these kind of metal rings. But, there is a place where your remains are put, and there's a little marker so that if family, loved ones, want to come and visit a grave, it's there. And that is required by Ohio statute, although at times Hamilton County has been pretty negligent in how it follows that statute. So cremation, it takes up less real estate, obviously, and in the long term, it's a cheaper process, but it's not free. So, New York is still burying people they're still burying entire bodies as opposed to cremains. And I think there's a couple reasons why that happens. One of them is just financial. I think what they have going on in New York is cheaper, so that's what they do. But secondly, there are also religious questions around cremation. And, that's particularly true of certain types of religious traditions. In the Catholic faith, cremation was absolutely prohibited until 1963 and still frowned upon by a lot of Catholics. In Judaism, cremation still remains problematic. So, there is, and that's true of other, I think in Islam as well, Judaism and Islam, they're both kind of similar in this concept of how your body is treated after death has ramifications to what happens to you in the afterlife. So aside from those religious concerns, there's also, I think, just very secular, although philosophical concerns over how human beings treat fellow human beings when we leave this planet. And, when you look at a place like Spring Grove Cemetery, you see this very beautiful celebration of lives lived and the people that are in that cemetery. It is this beautiful contemplative space to go and, think about people that you have known, you have loved that are there, or also just, people you never knew. It's this kind of really elegant celebration of life, and it's a beautiful place. And that's in very stark contrast to what's going on in Potter's Field and Cincinnati. And I'm not someone, I don't know that I haven't met anyone actually, who advocates for the need to bury everyone who cannot afford a private burial, with a $50,000 mausoleum. But what's happening in Potter's Field in Cincinnati is that the people that are interred there are really treated with zero respect. And that's what this is really all about, is what's going on with Potter's Field, what's happened with it, and what to do with it. So I'm going to take that discussion up, specifically about Cincinnati's Potter's Field, what's happening, how we got there, and how we fix it in the second part of this.